Hey everybody, it's EJ from Eyedesyn.com, and today I'm going to be showing you 5 different ways to speed up your ambient occlusion rendering inside of Cinema 4D, and even a handy tip for game developers out there. So let's jump right in and learn how. Alright, how about we start by just going over what ambient occlusion is? Well, ambient occlusion tries to recreate the shading that happens when two objects are close to each other or in corners of objects. So if you're in a room right now and you look at the corner of your room, you're gonna see a little bit of shading. So like take your time, look at all the corners in your room, unless you live in an Oval Office or something. Look at the corners of your room, you're gonna see that shading happen. So that's what ambient occlusion does. You can see the scene if I just render it right now, my happy little townhouses, my happy little trees that would really make Bob Ross happy is nice and flat, no real definition where the nooks and crannies of all these objects are or where objects are touching. But when I apply ambient occlusion as a global effect, hit render, you can see now we have all this really nice definition where objects are touching, and in the corners of like our windows, where the bottom of our townhouses are hitting the floor, really nice shading. Well, the first tip to help speed up your ambient occlusion renders is to first go into your ambient occlusion global effect, and the one thing I really want to pay attention to is this maximum ray length. Of course, we can also adjust the accuracy, the minimum and maximum samples, and that's all dependent on how much time are you willing to spend rendering this thing. But the maximum ray length is actually dependent on your specific scene that you're in or that you built. So the maximum ray length is kind of like how far blurred out or how far does this ambient occlusion want to calculate to actually make that shading. So right now by default, we have a maximum ray length of 200. If I crank this up to 300, you can see that we have even more blurring and a lot more darkened areas in here, and it also is taking longer to render. So sometimes this is just overkill, right? So what we want to do is actually see how far do we want this blurred out by the object size of the object's sizes in our scene. So how I like to kind of gauge how much blurring we really need or how much we want that ray length to go is just create a cube, and cubes by default are 200 by 200 by 200. Let me just move this in my scene here. Alright, so my cube here is 200 by 200 by 200, and if we want to see what 100 centimeters look like, well that's it. That's as big as one of our windows. So really, that's kind of overkill for ambient occlusion for the scale of this scene. So what we can actually do is see if we can get away with like 50 centimeters so we can see how much that looks like. And that's a little bit better. You know, that's probably all we want the blurring to really go. And even I think maybe 50 is a little bit too much. So, but we'll just go with 50 for now. We'll delete our cube. And let's first go ahead and let's render this with, say, 350, right? So let's go and render this to picture viewer. I'm going to right over that. And let's see how long this takes to render. So that's about 7 seconds with a maximum ray length of 350. And you can see our nice shading in here. You can see how far that ambient occlusion shading kind of blurs out, and some of it's really unnecessary because some of it's so subtle that really it's just render time that you don't need to spend on all that small detail. So let's go ahead and let's do 35 and render this out. We'll just rewrite over our old file, and you can see that this is still pretty good. We have some really nice definition in here, but you can definitely tell that we cut down our render time in half, and you can see the difference between the two. So you can see that if you just balance what your minimum ray length or even aesthetically what you want, sometimes you just want that little nice definition between objects. Because you know, if we have this up at 1,000, that's even nuttier than the 300. And if we render that, let's see how long that takes. So we got this rendering here, and again, it gets to a point where you just can't even really tell the difference. And again, that's 7 seconds. And this is the difference between the two. And when you get that maximum ray length that blurred out, you start to see little gunky samples anyways. So a lot of the time, it's really balancing aesthetically what you want and how far you can really get away with the smallest ray length to really optimize your render time. So for me personally, I would say that 3-second render is just as good as the 7-second render, and you just cut your render time in half just by adjusting this maximum ray length setting. So that's one way. The second way is by not using the global setting here, and it's by actually applying ambient occlusion to actual materials in your scene. So what does that mean? Well, we can actually apply ambient occlusion as an effect. So if I want to say apply ambient occlusion to every object that has this green, so all the tree leaves, how you apply ambient occlusion as an effect, to a material is by loading it in the diffusion channel and checking on all these effect options, luminous specular reflection, and going into effects and ambient occlusion. So now if I go ahead and I render this out, you can see that we have ambient occlusion applied to every material that has that green. Well, what if we want to apply this to every object in our scene, or just a few? Let's say we just want to apply it to just a few of these objects right here. We're going to go ahead and uncheck that diffusion, check it back on again, because we're dealing and editing multiple textures here, and I actually want to get that window texture there too, because I definitely want to apply that there. And we're just going to go ahead and make sure we check all these on. So that's, you can see it, that's updating all of our materials. Go into our effects again, and you can see this has multiple values because only one of those textures, that green texture, actually has ambient occlusion already applied. So just going to apply this over again, and now we should actually have ambient occlusion that we can actually click into and then adjust. So we can go in here and say, let's do 50 again. It's going to update all of the textures, and we can render that out. So what's the benefit of applying it as a material, or through a material? Well, one way is that, say you only want ambient occlusion to happen on certain objects. This is one way to really go in on those actual objects and just apply it to the materials on that specific object. And then there's some times where you just have an object sitting in space, say like a sphere, just standing around in space, or a very complex scene where it's not even touching anything, and ambient occlusion wouldn't be affected by it at all anyways. The problem is that with the global ambient occlusion effect here, it takes into account every single object in your scene, whether it's in your viewport view or not. So if there's a bunch of stuff behind here that we can't actually see in our render, our scene-wide ambient occlusion is still going to look and try to calculate for it. So that kind of bogs down your render needlessly. So that's kind of where having your ambient occlusion applied as a material can kind of come in handy as well. So that helps speed up your scene, especially with way more complex scenes than this, because this really isn't that complex, so you won't really notice too much of a difference. But with super, super complex scenes, you're really going to notice. So scene-wide versus via material ambient occlusion, another way to speed up. Another way is by using the ambient occlusion cache option, which is right here. And I believe this was added in R15. And the nice thing about the ambient occlusion cache, let me actually just go into all my materials again and shut off the diffusion ambient occlusion. So we're back to square one. What the ambient occlusion cache does is it takes all the sampling that we have here. So let's actually bump this up to like 150 and enable the cache. And what this is going to do, and the important part of the cache, is it works like any other cache. So say you have a MoGraph cache or dynamics cache. What it does is it caches all that information, saves it somewhere, so you don't have to recache that every single time you want to render a scene or play back in your viewport. Where this is the same thing, where the whole point of the cache is to render your cache once, render your ambient occlusion once, and if you don't change anything or move anything, you can just reuse that cache. So let's go through this here. So we have this cache option. We can adjust the samples. Right now it's 128. That's fine. we have these options right here that I really want to talk about is the cache file. So by default, we have this auto save. So what happens when we do that is when we render a scene, it's going to automatically save our ambient occlusion cache into a file. And right now the location is just in my little, on my desktop right here. And we also have this full animation mode. So if you're just dealing with a still, you actually don't need to have that full animation mode, so it won't calculate for any motion. So, but I'm just going to keep this on. Or actually, I'll turn that off because I'm just dealing with a still right now. So what I'm going to do is just render out a still. So I'm going to render this out. I got my cache turned on. What we're going to notice is we have this AO cache prepass calculating that then saves into a folder. So you see this folder, this default location. Well, I actually have this illumination folder with an AO file, ambient occlusion file that saved and cached that ambient occlusion that's applied to my scene. So where this comes in handy is when you have, say, a client that's like, I love this, but I want to change the color of the trees to red because I'm a crazy client and I ask for nonsensical things. So we're going to be like, okay, we'll do that, client, crazy client guy, and rechange the color. And then you're like, well, now I have to re-render this. And the client's like, oh, that's okay, I'll pay for it. And you're like, yes, because that's going to take forever, right? We're going to have to re-render this and redo that very time-consuming ambient occlusion calculation. Well, that's what the client thinks, but actually what happens is if you use the cache option, we can actually say, okay, we have that cache saved in our little file. Remember our little file guy right here? So we actually already have that saved. And since we didn't move the position of everything, we can reuse the ambient occlusion, right? So we need to change on this, turn on the auto load, and then what we're going to also do is say, hey, skip the prepass, that ambient occlusion prepass that occurred right down here. Skip it if there's already an ambient occlusion cache file saved here. So we're just going to skip over that whole process. All right, so we can render that out again. We'll just rewrite, and it's going to render. And you're going to notice that it actually didn't do that pre-cache that prepass because we said skip it and just reload the cache that we already calculated already. So you can see that by reusing that ambient occlusion cache, we just cut down our render by more than half. So that's very, very important to use the cache where you can. If you don't have objects moving around or you didn't change the movement of any of your animations, you're just changing colors and stuff like that, using the ambient occlusion cache will save you a ton of time because you render your cache once, render your ambient occlusion once, and boom, you're done. Another very handy tip it's more of a workflow tip, is we've been rendering the ambient occlusion and baking it into our actual image. So if we actually want to adjust this in post, we couldn't because it's baked in. So one important thing to remember to bake this as a multipass. Typically, you would go in here and say, okay, I want to render the ambient occlusion as a separate pass. You just say, okay, let's just choose JPEG. And let's save this as AO, and we'll just render, right? So now we have our ambient occlusion, and we have our multipass here. But the thing is we actually have this baked in as well. We actually have our ambient occlusion already baked in. So we just would double the ambient occlusion. So what we need to do first to make this work and not have this baked in is to actually go to this apply to project and turn that off. And you might freak out because you might see when you render that no ambient occlusion is applied, and you might think that it's not actually being saved or calculated, but it is because it's actually getting saved as the multipass. So if I go ahead and render this again, I just rewrite over all that stuff, you're going to see that we have no ambient occlusion baked into our image, but we have it as a multipass. So now what we can do, jump into our After Effects composition here and go in and import the ambient occlusion file and just the basic image. So here's the basic image without any ambient occlusion at all. And what we're going to do is just drag and drop that ambient occlusion patch on top of our rendered image. And then I believe we use the multiply blending mode. And now we have full control over the opacity of this, right? So now we're just, the whole mantra of check everything once, render once, and then be done with it. And then just do all your changes and adjustments inside of a compositor like After Effects. So very important thing, just need to do two things. And that is to go to ambient occlusion, turn off that apply to project, but make sure you add that ambient occlusion multipass. Very important. So that's like a nice workflow tip. Render once, mantra, just want to do that one time. And the last thing I want to go over is a pretty handy tip, especially for game designers out there and game asset designers. And this kind of bakes in ambient occlusion to the actual material. So I know a lot of game developers, you actually have to bake in the ambient occlusion in there because everything has to be light. These game engines don't apply it for you some of the time. So you always want to optimize. So say I want to bake in ambient occlusion to this building object here. Let's just make sure that we have ambient occlusion turned on. We'll have that applied, looking good. And what we're going to do and we can apply this to our whole scene, but I just want to show you what happens when we do this on an object level. What we can do to bake in the ambient occlusion to an object as a material is to go up to objects, go to bake object, and then make sure we have ambient occlusion turned on. Now, depending on what your final output's going to be, you might have to jack up the width and height segments to maybe like 2K or something like that for just to maintain quality. But for our instance, we're fine with 512. We're just going to hit bake, and then you're going to see this little window update, and you can see all our little aspects of our townhouse here appear. You can see the ambient occlusion applied to each UV and each polygon here. And then you're going to see that I also added a new material into our scene. And finally, you're going to see that, hey, look at that. We actually have ambient occlusion applied to our object here. And it's in our viewport, and you can see that, hey, that looks like a game asset. We have the ambient occlusion baked in. You can see that our original building is turned off, and at the very top of our object manager here, we have a duplicate with that new material, that building material, applied to it. So I can move this around, and you can see that, hey, we got our ambient occlusion baked into a material. So this is very handy because then you already rendered the ambient occlusion. Now you're just rendering out a texture. So there's no ambient occlusion calculation aside from the one you just did when you baked it into your object. So game designers, for whatever, if there's no motion or anything on objects, this is a very handy thing to do to actually bake the ambient occlusion into your objects. Then you don't have to deal with pre-caching or anything like that. You just bake it right into the material. So just to recap, we had 5 different ways to speed up ambient occlusion. We had the ray length settings, right? So we had the ray length settings. We had the cache to enable cache, and then use the cached AO file to speed up anything that doesn't change in position or anything like that. We also were shown how to turn off the apply to project and just save and render out ambient occlusion as a separate pass, so we can then composite it and art direct it in a renderer. And then we went over how to apply it as a global effect, or by applying ambient occlusion to the diffusion channel to really just pinpoint what objects we want to apply ambient occlusion to, just to keep down the calculations. And then finally, how to bake ambient occlusion into your material using the object bake object command. All right, so that was the 5 ways to speed up your ambient occlusion rendering. Now, did you know all 5? If you did, let me know. Which ones didn't you know? I'd love to hear those as well. Do you have a 6th or 7th ambient occlusion speed up trick that I did not cover. I'd love to hear if you have any other techniques out there that I did not cover. Always up for learning more. So that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to hit it in the comments section. And if you like this tutorial, be sure to give it some love and hit the like button. But I will see all of you guys in the next tutorial. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye, everybody.